Hello and welcome. My name is Devin Hennon. I'm the Director of Marketing at Rook Quality Systems, and I'm thrilled to have you join us today for Evidence Strategy That Wins, Aligning Clinical Validation, FDA Pathway, and Investor Expectations. Presented by Kyle Rose, the CEO and founder of Rook Quality Systems, and Natalie Freels, founder of Insight Health Consulting. Before we dive in, just a few quick housekeeping items. As a thank you for attending today, you'll receive a complimentary evidence strategy worksheet to help you apply today's concepts to your own use case. So keep an eye out for that in your inbox within the next 24 hours or so. Along with that, you will receive a recording of today's session, the slides, and additional resources from Rook. You will see a Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So please go ahead and drop your questions in there throughout the session, and we'll address as many as we can at the end. And you can also use the chat to say hello and let us know where you're joining from today. We would love to hear from you. Finally, at Rook, we provide ongoing regulatory and quality education through monthly webinars, case studies, and blogs, tools, and much more. So follow us on LinkedIn and visit us at rookqs.com to stay up to date on everything we have to offer, which is a lot. So with that, I will hand things over to Kyle to get us started.
All right. Thank you, Devin. I'm Kyle Rose, CEO and founder of Rook Quality Systems. I started the company going on 14 years, so 2012. So 14 years ago, having worked in the med device industry from a few different companies, big and small, diagnostics, contact lenses, and a wide range of medical device companies. And I saw when working in an industry that there was a big gap in quality consulting and regulatory consulting as far as really wanting to make this process as efficient as possible. And that's really the main focus of Rook is to help companies with their quality and regulatory strategies, actually implementing these things and making sure that it's as efficient as possible throughout the whole process and life cycle of a medical device. Within the scope of working at Rook, we've helped NIH with multiple programs, including the RADx program supporting over 100 COVID diagnostics during the pandemic. I'm also an advisor for multiple Fortune 500 companies, supporting every aspect of quality and regulatory for medical device, software devices, diagnostics, really any type of device. Our company, our team has worked with that type of device. We also like to work with super early stage, so academic, universities, we do incubators, hospital systems, accelerators, things like that. So very open to helping companies, just providing advice or mentorship as they're going through the process of trying to determine what the plan is for their device, how they're going to commercialize it, what the strategy is, things like that. And a lot of that really ties to our topic today as well. We can move on to the next slide. So, just a high level overview of Rook. At Rook, we are again a medical device consulting firm, but we support all types of devices, everything from software devices, hardware, electrical, diagnostic devices, complex to super simple devices. We support all types of devices. Our team is now up to close to 40 people on our team. So, they're all full-time Rook employees that support our clients around the world. We have a US branch and we also have an APAC branch based in Taiwan. As we talked about, our kind of main focus is making this process as efficient as possible. We also really focus on kind of a patient first mentality. So ensuring that everything we're doing related to the clients that we support is, number one priority is the patient safety. With the scope of medical device, it's going to affect somebody in either diagnosis or actual use. So we want to make sure that the medical devices that we're supporting have the safety requirements, meet the testing, and are, meeting the latest requirements and regulations. Also very proactive with our support. So really, wanting to give our clients the best tools, the best approach, the best resources. This really, relates with our templates and how we manage all of our ongoing QMS. Every audit that we do, we review for any of our clients and see if there's ways that we can improve the template package, improve the way we do things, and then spread that out to the rest of our clients as well. So always learning from our experience, our regulatory experience with the FDA, our audit experience to help improve our product and our templates and stuff like that for our clients. And the other is high tech and high touch. Our team is very responsive. I think that's one of the things that really separates us from other consulting firms is how responsive and accessible our team is. So a lot of times we're integrating in Team Slack and Teams and things like that to really help them throughout the process and be part of their team when they're moving through all of the different phases of medical device development, testing, and then post-market medical device quality regulations as well. So that's a high-level overview of Rook. We will have a Q&A session at the end if anybody has questions specific to Rook or our services as well. I'm going to pass it over to Natalie.
Thank you so much, Kyle. It's awesome to be back here with Rook again. This is our second year doing, a similar webinar. So my name is Natalie Freels. I have a medical background as a PA, but I've worked in healthcare for over the last 10 years, pre-hospital in the ED, in the clinic, and now as a hospital medicine expert. I absolutely love it. My home base is here in Jacksonville, Florida, where I'm located, and I practice in academic medicine. Outside of that, I've done research on wearables and practice optimization. I am an informaticist, so I do a lot with helping our Epic Center, Epic instance perform at its top level. And I've done a lot within the academic medical center that I work at with doing tech implementation. What does it mean to develop a great piece of product? And what does it mean to roll it out and implement it successfully? And so I've taken, some of that work and have started to do that with startup groups over the last 2 years. I work with groups all the way from really early stage startups to very established companies looking to expand into new verticals. And where I really come into play is helping with that clinical implementation pathway. What does it mean to take the product that you've developed and come up with a really great end-to-end use case analysis of how would someone use that? How do we communicate that value it's going to bring to the team? So many times, we have a great piece of tech, but we're really missing that totally fine-tuned use case and then fine-tuned value proposition and messaging. I worked really well with product development teams, systems engineers, founders of all stages, and it's been really, really fun to work with super encouraging and inspiring founder teams who want to bring a solid product to the market, ultimately to give better patient care. I'm also a member of the American Academy of PAs, and I also hold a dual board certification as a lifestyle medicine PA. You can go to the next slide. So this is a little bit about my consulting firm, Insight Health Consulting. We are a fractional advisory firm focused on product strategy, clinical implementation, and value proposition and value messaging. We focus in the digital health, AI, and health tech solutions space. I've also done work with more traditional MedTech and MedTech devices. It's led by me, an actively practicing hospitalist PA, and informaticist, really working boots on the ground in the trenches with patients and other providers. Our core focus really is clinical use mapping, making sure that products and teams are able to communicate how the product will be used in order to differentiate it from others on the market. That's a huge, I think, misstep that a lot of people oversee or forget to oversee. And we help with that team translation, helping those clinicals and engineering business sides of one individual company be able to speak the same language and then ultimately communicate that value to your clinical counterpart, your administrative counterpart, or that executive that's looking at procurement. And then that really ties into what it means to, hone in on a very clean and clear value proposition for your product.
All right. Well, thanks, Natalie. Thanks again for joining us. It is always great to have your experience and expertise in these webinars, and also, working with some of our clients together really benefit a lot of our clients as well. So for today's agenda, we have a few topics we're going to kind of walk through. First being what good evidence means to the FDA. So how to kind of really define, especially in the clinical scope, what they're looking for and how that relates to what the FDA wants to see. Where regulatory strategy alone falls short, evidence that drives adoption and investment, and then designing integrated evidence from day one. And then we'll have some key takeaways and Q&A at the end as well. So feel free, there is a Q&A section in the chat, so feel free to either chat or add your questions to the Q&A, and we'll address those at the end as we're going through. Again, this is being recorded, so if you can't stay the whole time, we'll also share the recording with you. All right, on to the next slide. And then just also wanting to kind of highlight who this webinar kind of really reaches. And so you're in the right place if you're kind of in any of these scopes of a stage of your company, role of your company, things like that. So if you're preparing for a 510(k), a de novo, a PMA, or any international submissions. I know the EU MDR will need clinicals for a lot of those. So any of those types of preparing to get your first regulatory clearance definitely will cover a lot of stuff you need to know. If you're a med device company actively fundraising or entering due diligence, a lot of this will also apply to you. The process of fundraising or due diligence with an acquisition partner, they review all of this in more detail than your FDA, your ISO auditor. So you want to make sure that all of your clinical strategy, your clinical data really aligns with what they're going to see, because then they're going to really take that on to the next level. If you're in the process of designing your validation strategies as a QA/RA lead for your company or your clients, also a good fit for this. Any product development or strategy teams that are, working on a new med device, new medical software, things like that, also very relevant. Any agile development with regulatory evidence. So this is something that we work a lot with: software devices, digital health, AI, ML type software devices. And I think this is always a gap that we see when we're talking with these companies early on, is they think that the internal testing they've done is going to be enough, or think that they can use the same data sets that they use to create the algorithm, to test the algorithm. And those are both big issues when you go to the FDA. So really want to make sure that if you are developing a software device, SAMD or SIMD, or even a digital health, that you are kind of really focused on the type of clinical evidence you need, and aligning with the regulatory strategy, but also your post-market strategy as well. And if you're planning any post-market studies for commercial stage, this is also, some of the topics we'll cover today. So all of these areas, a lot of different buckets, but still covers a lot of the same information in the following slide. So on to the next slide, as far as evidence planning and what you could do wrong. So what not to do. So when you are planning your validation strategy, you want to make sure that you are planning it to align both with your regulatory as well as any kind of down the stream efforts, whether that's acquisition or just broadly going commercial. You want to make sure that the evidence you're going to collect aligns with both of these strategies. A lot of times we've seen companies that are just focused on the regulatory, but didn't really incorporate the commercial. Again, built in silos. They didn't have kind of really the full scope of study that they needed. We've also seen a lot of companies, especially the ones that were initially started as direct to consumer or didn't have a regulatory or medical device approach, doing studies, collecting data without, doing the additional regulatory requirements as well, to make sure that the data they are collecting can be used for a submission. I think that's one of the things that we have found that's been the hardest to do. Is there's a lot of requirements around, informed consent and who can be included in the study, who cannot, inclusion, exclusion criteria, things like this, that needs to be captured before you start enrolling patients or subjects in a study. So you want to make sure that if you are doing a study and it might eventually lead to a medical device, even if you're purely a consumer device, we've done this with a lot of wearables and monitoring devices, where that area around what's a device and what's not a device is kind of gray. And there's been a lot of recent stuff lately from the FDA that's also made that somewhat unclear. But if you are going through the effort and the cost of doing some sort of study, I think it's definitely worth it to make sure you include these regulatory aspects. So if you do end up being able to use that down the road for regulatory submission, you've already built it successfully. I think that's one thing that can definitely cost you twice if you don't plan ahead and say, hey, how else can we use this study down the road if we do pivot towards a medical device. There's also the opposite, right? So the companies that have plans strictly for their regulatory submission or what was done by their predicate, but have not planned for the commercial aspect of this as well, as how to sell that to the people they'll be selling to, as hospital systems, or direct to consumer. Really planning that your study will both meet the regulatory requirements, but also will help you in the commercial phase of actually selling your product once you're able to do that post regulatory clearance. Another issue we've seen with a lot of our clients and people we advise is really, trying to redesign or pivot your study in the middle of a study. And that's something that's very difficult to do. A lot of times there's IRBs or in some cases pre-sub or regulatory communications already had or happened with the FDA. And if you're trying to change your study once you've already started, that can cause bigger questions or more questions from FDA or regulatory reviewers, really. So you want to make sure that as you're designing your study and planning, that you assume or have done some sort of pre-testing or pre-planning to make sure that you don't have to change your study or redesign your device midstream, which could then, cost you more money and a lot of times potentially have to um, pause or restart the study. There are cases where FDA will allow you to restart your study. So say you collected some clinical data and you package that up, submit it to the FDA. They said they wanted more data or additional sites or to include, different use cases. And sometimes they'll allow you to actually reopen that study and use the initial data and add on additional with the new collection. So some of this can be worked out with the FDA, but it's really critical if you can do it from the start to really plan ahead to make sure you're covering everything you can within the study, both regulatory and commercial scope, and also do some pre-testing, pre-studies to make sure that you're not going to have any major design changes or protocol changes to your study. But once you start the study, the things I think we've seen with multiple clients, and we actually do a more hands-on job now of actually helping companies advise in their clinical strategy, write their clinical protocols, have pre-sub meetings with the FDA to ensure they have a sound clinical study plan and a protocol that meets the requirements of the FDA. The FDA pre-submission process is great for actually aligning with the FDA as to what they want to see for your device. You can also ask broad questions around your predicate device, your verification testing. But a lot of companies, and Rook included, will use that pre-submission meeting as a way to confirm the clinical study, the clinical endpoints, this number of subjects. All of these things can be confirmed and aligned with the FDA. Just as a high level pre-submission meeting is something that you can submit to the FDA. It's actually a free process. It takes about 3 to 4 months to get a meeting set after you submit it. We really recommend that companies, work with an advisor, regulatory consultant like Rook, to plan ahead and not ask open-ended questions, but really define the strategy and then ask the FDA to confirm that with the pre-sub. Doing that as well as aligning with your regulatory advice or your commercial advisors, your sales team, really will help you kind of have a strong planning towards your clinical study to make sure you're avoiding any of these things that can make you, double your costs, double your timeline. All of those things are devastating for early stage startups. So really want to make sure you're planning ahead and having, the most efficient use of your time and money for your clinical validation. All right, on to the next slide. Starting at the foundation. So what good evidence means to the FDA? So with this, a lot of this ties back to the actual kind of foundations of your quality system, your design control process, linking your intended use and your clinical claims and your user needs through the process of development and verification and validation. Dive into FDA, QMSR, and the ISO 13485 requirements. Requires you to, define the intended use, define the user needs for your product and different aspects of your product, and then really trace those through the whole process of design control to say these are the user needs, this is how it ties to specifications, this is how we meet the specifications with our design outputs, whether that's software code or wireframes or drawings or material specs, whatever it is for your device. All those things should be traceable, showing how your device that you're designing meets the initial user needs and the intended use for your product. As you move through this phase of design and development and design controls, you get to verification and validation. A lot of these are tied to specific standards. So anything from biocompatibility to electrical safety to wireless connectivity. All of these are high-level standards the FDA and ISO mandate to make sure that you are meeting the broad safety and effectiveness requirements, as well as what's defined in your predicate or de novo or PMA pathway. This traceability really allows you to say, hey, we defined these things, and now we're going to show that we've tested it and they work. So that's really the main focus of design control and design development in a medical device quality system. So that's why it's really critical for companies to start and document this process as early as possible. And the handout that we'll give after the webinar also aligns with a lot of this just planning of what's your device going to do, who's going to use it, and then making sure you have the proper controls and testing in place as well. So this is really what the FDA wants to see when they're asking for evidence around your product and your testing around your device. Again, we meet with all types of startups, a lot of companies that didn't necessarily plan to have a medical device when they started developing their software or device, and then realize that there are a lot of regulatory requirements for the actual process before they can start selling it. So we really want to make sure that you're planning ahead. A lot of times we do early regulatory and clinical strategy assessments to make sure that you know all that's going to be required for your device before you're going to be able to submit to the FDA and then eventually sell and commercialize that product. Risk management's another big aspect of this evidence is really, doing a broad thought experiment of what could go wrong with your device and how you're going to mitigate that, whether it's through design, through labeling, through training. There's different ways to mitigate risk, but you really want to go through the process of evaluating all the different risks for your product and making sure that those have been properly defined and then also addressed to prevent these risks from happening when your device is actually on the market. One of the things that we see time and time again is that companies assume that these bad things will never happen and it'll be easy to use and everybody will pick it up the first time and have a great experience. Well, in reality, when you actually put your product out on the market with untrained users and people that rarely read the user manual, there's a lot of things that happen that come back and you get complaints or potential adverse events or potential recalls, really. So as much planning as you can do ahead of time to prevent those things, the more likely you'll be set up for commercial success and won't have to worry about high-level complaints or any adverse events or any recalls or things like that. So really making sure that you follow this process. It is really well defined and really useful if you follow it along the process during your development. And then all this ties back to your actual clinical strategy. So even devices that don't necessarily need clinical studies or clinical validation for a 510(k), it's a good practice to do some sort of clinical testing, do some sort of usability study to make sure that when your product hits the market, it's got great adoption, it's being used properly. The people that are using it are referring it to other people, things like that. So that is one of the things that we also recommend. We also see clients that, go ahead and do a clinical study just for the marketing and sales side of it as well, even if it's not required for their actual regulatory submission. So all of these aspects are things you definitely need to do and actively incorporate into your design and development to make sure your testing meets the requirements of the FDA, as well as also once you're actually in the market, you're actually selling a device that's safe, effective, and has commercial success. All right, next slide. So this again ties to where your regulatory strategy alone falls short. So again, within the scope of the FDA, they have requirements. Some products need regulatory, some don't. Some products only need a little bit of regulatory data to move forward, whereas others might need more. So really, this regulatory strategy is only part of it, and in some cases can fall short of what's needed for commercial success.
I love it. Thanks, Kyle. I think that, something that Kyle mentioned that I think is such a helpful frame is this aspect of the regulatory studies that the FDA and a group like Rooks will help companies, absolutely nail. they sometimes can lack credibility when you go to talk to a clinician, or they don't capture the entire question of, well, what can this product do for me and for my team? Because what the FDA is looking for and what a clinician or a procurement team may be looking for, there definitely have similarities, but it doesn't always capture the same aspects of value that we want to see. And so where I think we can reframe is saying that regulatory clearance is not our end goal. Commercialization at scale is our end goal. Bringing the product to as much, patients and clinicians as possible is the end goal. And regulatory, excellence and regulatory clearance is just one of many very important milestones. So where we can kind of reframe here is that it's very possible to achieve regulatory success, but still not have the data or the framing where a hospital executive or a clinic manager sees your product and says, ah, yes, I can see the value there. And so that's where I really would like us to think about it differently. So think about, how can we design studies and frame value around how clinicians decide to adopt, how hospital procurement teams evaluate a product, how different levels or different areas of care actually may think of value differently and have stakeholders that have different needs. How can we make sure that we're capturing and we're communicating the things that those individual stakeholders care about in different ways, and really leveraging the hard work and capital we're putting into regulatory strategy to spring us forward into really successful commercialization. So you can go ahead to the next slide, Devin. Oh, and then I think the last thing I'll add is then, of course, what does that say for your investors, right? Because you have to remember that many of the people, if you're raising capital, many investors, have not had, significant FDA regulatory experience. Many investors may not even have had direct bedside or, clinical executive experience. So they're going to need to hear the value story that you're telling in maybe a different way. And I think it's something that is easily done as long as we're intentional about giving each stakeholder the pieces of value and information that they really do need. So what matters to somebody like me? And I did scan the chat. I do know that there are a few other clinicians here, so thank you. That's awesome. I love to see clinical representation. But what matters for somebody like me day to day is this ability to see a product and exactly in my mind understand how it's different from the product that was pitched to me last week, right? To be able to see how this either is different from an incumbent product or the way I currently deliver care or the way I could deliver care with your competitor. So that kind of clinical differentiation is going to be super important. And then this aspect of workflow compatibility. And where I'll even add on this is workflow credibility. Are you able to credibly talk about, with the correct words, with a humble understanding of how we deliver healthcare? Because I can tell you from firsthand experience when I talk with founders and, they kind of preach at, how people deliver care. And sometimes I think that's not how most sites do it at all, right? So I think it's this kind of element of knowing and being able to talk about with the right lingo, with the right words, with a humble understanding of how healthcare is delivered, that really gives teams, such great credibility. And it's the same with operational leaders. So when I think of, a lot of people ask, well, what is clinical operations? So that would be someone who's like an administrative role. They're overseeing clinical care. They're working alongside clinical partners to help either in a clinic or at a hospital, at an ambulatory surgical service center. So these kinds of people, they often are MBAs, MHAs. Sometimes they're nurses or clinicians that have transitioned into more, administrative roles. So they often have some clinical understanding. Some of them don't have bedside experience, but their needs are different from a clinician, right? Their focus is more on patient flow. How does this affect staffing? How does this affect, our economics? How does this affect our budget? So ultimately, patient success, patient outcomes is going to be the most important, but we're going to need to highlight more administrative and economically based value for these kinds of operational leaders. And then the last one, of course, is investors, right? And investors is rarely ever clinical sometimes, and not always, someone who's worked in operations. And so where we're going to have to paint a picture of value for them is how our product is able to commercialize strongly while, showing value to clinicians and operations leaders. Paint a picture for how the product is able to differentiate in the market to someone who maybe doesn't have as much background on the clinical aspect or clinical application of its use. So this kind of question shift comes from, can I get this regulated? Can I get this approved by the FDA? Becomes, can I get this adopted at scale? We can go to the next slide, Devin. And one thing I'll say is, I think sometimes it can feel daunting, right? Like to take one data set and have all these different interpretations. But what I can tell you, on a larger scale as a researcher is that is one of the most important aspects of good clinical research, is that we should be able to look at different, multiple endpoints and be able to say different things that this has shown and be able to paint a story for different groups of people based on what matters to them, not in a way that changes the data, in a way that, highlights different things that the product can bring to the facility. So this question of, well, then how do we create, or how do we best capture data in this manner? It really starts by defining this need. So what is the unmet need that the clinical product is posing itself to fulfill? What is the way that we currently deliver healthcare? What are the incumbents doing, and where do they fall short? How do we position ourselves as the better option, right? And so then the second question would be, how do we measure that? How can we reliably and accurately, and taking time and budget constraints into mind, capture the data that shows those things? And I think, where a lot of people forget is, even in the early stages, asking questions. What is the way? How do we map that clinical workflow end to end in granular detail? Right. So I'm someone that I do a lot of work in what I call like disaster recovery or digital outage work. Right. So I do a lot of work around what happens when our hospital doesn't have internet or access to our EMR. And that's a great example of really getting into the details of how you deliver care in every single step. And I kind of tell that story just to get people's heads wrapped around this idea of, you gain credibility with your, potential buyer or your investor or maybe a pilot partner when you can really explain how the product will be used step by step by step. When Kyle mentions, that clinical use that and your claims for the FDA, that is just a really, really small piece of how that product fits into the bigger care delivery encounter. And so if you can come to the table and be able to explain not only the pinpoint use, but how it is able to be used at a much, within the whole encounter, you have so much more credibility with your listener. And I think the last part of it is, when you understand not only the clinical use case or the, claims very, very specific use, but you understand implementation at a larger scale, you're able to anticipate upstream and downstream effects. And being able to bring those to the table, really, really increases that credibility. You're able to anticipate barriers to implementation and in advance find solutions to navigate those. And we can go to the next slide. So, I think this really comes from having, from day one, designing integrated evidence. And that's where you're, just like Kyle said, we're not having to do double work, right? We're able to make a strategy and a program in which we're collecting data that gives credibility when we get to commercialization. So, Kyle had a great point about, what is your inclusion and exclusion criteria? Did you include people in this study that, as a researcher, coming, from a deep IRB background, we know that would not have led to a great outcome as far as the integrity of the data. People can lose credibility when they don't know the answers to those questions, as far as what their internal studies captured, or even, some external studies that they may have ran. So when we start from day one, I think we not only can save time, save money, but really build credibility when it comes to commercialization. And commercialization at scale is really all about trust. And so I think that's super important.
So again, yeah, back making sure that the trials that serve every stakeholder. So again, making sure that you are aligning endpoints with FDA expectations, early feasibility, pilot, pivotal, all align on your overall plan, and then avoid over and under building evidence at different fundraising stages. So really kind of aligning with your final strategy. I think one thing we've seen in this as well is kind of companies trying to plan out different features of their device and how that aligns with different studies. A lot of times we'll meet with companies early on that say, we have a device that might be our MVP that we want to take to market first, but then we have all these different features or analysis or software activities we can include or have already developed, but need to get the first one through regulatory clearance and then raise some more money before we can add on all the other bells and whistles to our product, right? So I think that's another part of the kind of planning for your regulatory and clinical strategy as to how you fit in the different aspects of your study. Usability is another thing I talked about earlier, and Natalie did as well. Is kind of how do you fit in the usability aspect as you're doing the actual clinical validation as well. A lot of times you can run that alongside your study. In some cases, you might want to do that twice, right? If you do your initial usability study, get some feedback from your users, and make some design changes, whether that's software or hardware or both, and then go back and do another usability just to show that, hey, we took the feedback from the users, the people we interviewed, the surveys, the risk analysis, all of these things, and made these updates and definitely allowed us to improve our device, reduce risk, reduce any, complaints or post-market activities as well. So I think using all of those things that align with your overall strategy and planning that early on, and then having a roadmap that is 3, 5 years down the road for your device development, your clinical regulatory process really, is what helps separate companies that are, have a plan for success versus companies that are really just kind of moving through and coming up with it day to day. So I think working with thousands of med device companies and startups over the past 15 years, really, the ones that have been super successful, the ones that kind of plan all these things out from the start, have it aligned with their budget and timeline, and then kind of move through this very strategically and have a much higher likelihood for success, both commercial and regulatory, if they have all this planned out from the start. And that way, there's much less risk of, you know, delays, additional fundraising rounds needed, things like that when you plan all this out from the start. All right, I think we can go to some key takeaways. All right. So, what you should walk away with is, a framework for evidence planning and how to kind of incorporate this in your whole process of development through commercialization, right? That's really the key. Is like now I said, not just, getting regulatory clearance, but really having a device that's going to have great market adoption and then grow to scaling your company. A clearer understanding of what your specific evidence expectations are and how to meet those and how to define those early on in your process. Insight into sequencing evidence to protect both runway and timeline. So kind of how to plan those along the path. A checklist of validation planning, mistakes to avoid. So really kind of what you want to make sure you're doing and prevent, making these changes midway through your trial or not incorporating other aspects of this to your validation strategy. And then greater clarity on how to align regulatory and commercialization strategy going forward. I think that's really the big one is how to align both of these so you are meeting requirements of both and, setting yourself up for the greatest chance of success. I think those things are really integral for any med device company, especially the startups that are going through this for the first time, making sure that they plan all these things ahead of time to make sure that they're on the right path, have experts advising them, have gotten some sort of feedback or buy-in from the regulatory bodies, whether that's FDA or international, but really planning ahead to make sure all of this stuff aligns with your broader strategy and commercial success. And I think we can now open it up to some questions. We've got our contact info here. Feel free to reach out, schedule a meeting with either myself or Natalie or both. We do combo meetings as well and can chat from both teams on our perspectives and how we support. So
Excellent. All right. Thank you. I'm going to start with a question we have here. Along the lines of evidence expectations, what are the biggest red flags investors might look for when evaluating a company's clinical evidence package during due diligence?
Kyle, do you want to start and then I'll add my 2 cents?
yeah, I can go from our side. I mean, I think we touched on some of those earlier on. I think with different types of devices or different things that they typically look at. But I think, some of the things we've seen issues, if you're an international company, you only have OUS data, that can be an issue. If you're a software company and a lot of your data is only tied to, one specific study or one specific data source, or if you're like an imaging or something like that, and you're only using one type of image, create, MRI or CT, whatever, that can also be an issue. It's harder for you to scale if you only have one type of data that you've been analyzing. I think with broader, just general hardware, typical devices, I think issues we've seen is kind of some of the inclusion, exclusion, and just having a limited kind of scope of uses or sites, whereas it might have been enough in 100 people to get through the FDA, but there's definitely some risk going forward for them saying, hey, we're now going to ramp up your sales and your marketing and get this all over the world, and they're doing that based on 100-person study that took 6 months, right? So I think that's some of the stuff. Unless you're really doing a good job of doing post-market follow-up, post-market data collection, things like that, then it can be hard sell for that kind of acquisition due diligence phase.
Yeah, and I can definitely agree with that. I work for a few funds doing diligence work, and as a clinician looking at the data collection pathway and really the believability and credibility of what they collected and then the claims based off of what they saw in the data. Does that really align with what we consider to be, quality standard data and research when we think of like practicing evidence-based medicine, number one. And then number two, a little bit more broad, but I can pretty quickly read a pitch deck and know if they talk to enough clinicians. And so it's more of a gestalt. I'm sorry, a little bit less like nuts and bolts data, but more just kind of this general feeling that you can get when you're talking with someone to know if they really ran this by and have worked with enough of your goal end user or your ideal customer. And so I think from a financial perspective, from an investing perspective, I get nervous when I talk with people who I don't think it's going to scale well because they truly haven't done enough market research. And I don't mean just pulling numbers on total available market. I mean actually getting out and talking to the ideal customer.
Thank you, guys. Okay, we have another question here from the audience. Are there any differences or key requirements to your approach for MDR approval?
Yeah, I mean, I think just kind of high level, there's a much bigger requirement for clinical data and post-market follow-up and clinical evaluation reports going from US FDA to MDR. And kind of that barrier to entry has continued to rise on the European side. And I think one of the key things that we've seen is obviously you need to have some clinical data. If your device does multiple things, your software analyzes different areas, then you need to have clinical studies for each one. The other kind of key areas is state of the art requirement as well. So making sure that you're defining how your device is state of the art, whether if it's a new device or an established device, that can get tricky, but that's a key thing to incorporate in your planning as you're kind of approaching MDR approval. Other key differences just from, some of the recent changes to MDR is the timeline has gotten significantly longer than it used to be for CE mark under MDD. So we're seeing 18 to 24 months, I would say is pretty typical for that process. And, at a time also increases costs. So those costs are increasing as well. But as far as within the scope of what we're looking at, definitely you will need clinical, you'll need additional literature review and searches for similar products, and you'll need that presented. I think the other thing that is a little bit of a change is that there is not a formal pre-sub process. There is some kind of communication that is going on. I think they just launched a new process recently, but it's not as cut and dry as a FDA pre-sub. So you really need to have very good justification internally with your documentation as to the sample size, the planning of your study, the endpoints, all of those things going in, so that you can present that and justify that to the technical reviewers and auditors as you're going through MDR.
Great, thank you. All right, well, that looks to be all the questions for today. I'll close us out here. Thank you everyone so much for joining us today, and thank you Kyle and Natalie for a great presentation. It's great to hear from you. For anyone that missed it in the beginning, you will receive the recording and the slides and the evidence strategy worksheet via email within the next 24 hours, and as well as some information about our next upcoming webinar. We thank you again for being here today. We hope you have a great rest of your day. Please don't hesitate to reach out to Kyle or Natalie with any questions on how we can help you. And thanks again. Have a great day.